Alright petrol heads, gather round. Today we're talking about horsepower, that magical number that gets every gearhead's heart racing. But what exactly is it? Well, we have to go back in time. Back to the days of steam engines and a clever chap named James Watt. See, Watt was a Scottish inventor who improved the steam engine. He needed a way to explain how powerful these new engines were. Back then, people used horses for, well, almost everything. So, Watt decided to compare his engines to these four-legged workhorses. He observed horses pulling coal out of mines. He figured out that a horse could pull a certain weight a certain distance in 1 minute. He called this one horsepower. Clever, eh? It was a stroke of genius, really. He gave people a way to understand the power of his engines in terms they knew. Of course, horses come in all shapes and sizes, just like engines. Some are more powerful than others. But Watt's definition stuck. And today, it's the standard unit of power for engines all over the world. But horsepower isn't just about history. It's about the thrill of acceleration, the roar of the engine. It's about the feeling of pure power at your fingertips. And that, my friends, is what we're going to explore. Now, before we get too far, we need to talk about torque. People often get these two confused, thinking they're the same thing, but they're not. Think of it this way. Imagine you're trying to loosen a rusty old bolt. You grab a wrench and give it a good twist. That twisting force you apply is torque. It's the rotational force an engine produces. Horsepower, on the other hand, is how quickly that force can be used. It's the rate at which work is done. In our wrench analogy, it's how quickly you can unscrew the bolt once you've overcome the initial resistance. So, torque is the grunt, the muscle. It's what gets you moving from a standstill. Horsepower is the stamina, the endurance. It's what determines how quickly you can accelerate and reach top speed. They work together, you see, like a well-oiled machine, or a well-trained horse if you prefer. You can have an engine with loads of torque but low horsepower. Think of a big lumbering truck. It can haul heavy loads, but it won't win any races. Conversely, a small, sporty car might have less torque but more horsepower. It might struggle to tow a trailer, but it'll leave you breathless on the open road. So, how do we measure this elusive horsepower? Well, we strap the engine to a machine called a dynamometer, or dyno for short. It's basically a giant treadmill for engines. The engine spins rollers at a specific speed, and the dyno measures the force it produces. Don't worry, it's not as brutal as it sounds. No engines are harmed in the making of these measurements. The dyno then uses a clever formula to calculate horsepower. The formula is horsepower equals torque times RPM divided by 5,252. Don't ask me where the 5,252 comes from, it's just some mathematical wizardry. The important thing is, the higher the torque and RPM, the higher the horsepower. But horsepower isn't just a single number. There are different types, each with its own meaning. We've got brake horsepower, wheel horsepower, electrical horsepower, and more. It's enough to make your head spin faster than an engine at redline. Section 4, Horsepower Alphabet, Soup, BHP, WHP, Electric Horsepower, demystifying the different breeds of horsepower. Let's break it down, shall we? BHP is the power measured directly at the engine's crankshaft, before it goes through the gearbox, driveshaft and whatnot. It's the purest form of horsepower, like a thoroughbred racehorse. WHP, on the other hand, is measured at the wheels. It takes into account the power losses that occur as the power travels through the drivetrain. Think of it as the horsepower that actually reaches the road. It's always lower than BHP because, well, physics. Then we have electrical horsepower, which is a whole other kettle of fish. It's the power produced by electric motors. Calculating it is a bit more complicated, but the principle is the same. How much work can the motor do in a given time? And don't even get me started on SAE net horsepower. That's a whole other story for another time. Just know that it's a standardized way of measuring horsepower, so you can compare apples to apples, or rather Mustangs to Camaros. Section 5, From Sedans to Supercars. Real-world examples of how horsepower translates to performance in different vehicles. Now let's talk about what really matters, how horsepower translates to real-world performance. Take a humble family sedan, for example. It might have, say, 150 horsepower, enough to get you from A to B comfortably, but don't expect it to set your heart racing. Now, crank things up a notch with a sporty hatchback packing 250 horsepower. Suddenly, overtaking maneuvers become effortless, and you might even crack a smile when you put your foot down. But for true adrenaline junkies, only a supercar will do. We're talking 500 horsepower, 600 horsepower, or even more. These beasts are designed for speed, with acceleration that'll make your head spin faster than a merry-go-round. And let's not forget about motorcycles. These two-wheeled rockets might be small, but they pack a serious punch. A liter bike with 200 horsepower can outrun most cars on the road. It's like strapping a jet engine to a bicycle. Trucks, on the other hand, are all about torque. They need that low-end grunt to haul heavy loads. But that doesn't mean they can't be powerful. Some heavy-duty trucks have over 500 horsepower, enough to tow a small planet. Section 6. Electric versus gas. The horsepower showdown between these two engine rivals, with a focus on instant torque. Speaking of power, we can't forget about the rise of electric vehicles. They're quiet, they're efficient, and boy, can they be quick. Electric motors produce instant torque, which means they accelerate like a cheetah on roller skates. No need to wait for the engine to rev up, just mash the pedal and hold on tight. Tesla, for example, has been giving traditional supercar makers a run for their money with their ludicrously quick electric cars. Gas engines, on the other hand, rely on internal explosions to generate power. It's a controlled chaos that's both fascinating and terrifying. They might not have the instant torque of electric motors, but they make up for it with their roaring exhaust notes and the visceral thrill of shifting gears. The horsepower wars are heating up, and it's an exciting time to be a car enthusiast. Whether you prefer the silent fury of electric motors or the thunderous roar of a V8, there's no denying the allure of horsepower. Section 7. Horsepower myths debunked. More horsepower doesn't always mean a faster car. We separate fact from fiction. Now, before we wrap up, let's debunk some common horsepower myths. First up, more horsepower doesn't always mean a faster car. Weight, aerodynamics, gearing, and a whole host of other factors come into play. You could have a 1,000 horsepower monster that handles like a wet sponge, while a lighter, more agile car with half the power could leave it for dust. And don't believe the hype about horsepower being the be-all and end-all of performance. Torque, as we discussed earlier, plays a crucial role, as does the way the power is delivered. A peaky engine that only comes alive at high RPM might sound impressive on paper, but can be a pain to live with on a daily basis. Ultimately, horsepower is just a number. It's how you use it that counts. Whether you're cruising down the highway, carving up mountain roads, or simply enjoying the open road, it's the experience that matters most. So, there you have it, folks. Horsepower, a historical curiosity, a unit of measurement, and a source of endless fascination for car enthusiasts worldwide. It's the lifeblood of performance, the thrill of acceleration, and the roar of the engine, all rolled into one.